Greetings. So sitting behind me here is a 2000 Trans Am that really doesn't need a mechanic, it needs an exorcist. So here is what we're going to do today. This video is actually a restart, sort of a fresh reset from a previous series entitled Test Your P0171, 0174 Lean Diagnostic Skills. And I will put a link to that. At least the first video in there I think is really worth watching. But the idea was this car with the 0171 code was supposed to be a very innocuous, simple to diagnose lean condition code that I thought would be a great case study to sort of apply the knowledge of lean condition diagnostics and fuel trims that we covered in other videos. If you're just joining and you have no idea what fuel trims are, then I will put a link to another video that if you watch it, I guarantee you, you will master the concepts of fuel trims. It will dramatically improve your ability to diagnose engine problems. But the idea was for people that already did look at that video or understand lean condition diagnosis, at least at a more advanced level, this was supposed to be a relatively innocuous case study. It turned out to be anything but. What happened was we found that there was an incredible amount of variability with this lean code as far as the reported data. The lean condition changes from being somewhat of a vacuum leak condition under some circumstances to being a fuel deficit lean condition or a extra unmetered air lean condition under other circumstances. And there was no consistency, especially with the scantool communication issues, which is really a major issue. It all kind of got out of control in that series, and I also sort of had a breakdown as I sort of was trying to get this under control and was learning myself about things called substituted values and generic versus enhanced scantool parameters, and it got crazy. So what we're doing in this video is we're going to step back, do what we do best. I'm going to, based on what I've learned from that previous series, we're going to restart. I'm going to get a definitive direction so that I know, are we chasing a fuel deficit lean condition issue? Are we chasing a unmetered air lean condition issue? Is it both? Is it one bank or is it two banks? There was some question about that too previously. And we're going to definitively find the track we need to be on so that we can test only the systems that would be applicable if this is actually a two-bank lean condition or a single-bank lean condition as was originally indicated. So let's do this. Let me catch you up real quick on where we're at, how we got here, and then how I'm going to determine scientifically where we need to go and know that that is going to finally be the right direction. So as stated, this started off as simple as can be. The car developed a check engine light, and it was a P0171 DTC, which is an O2 sensor lean bank 1. And this was confirmed also by a freeze frame that I pulled off the PCM that does indicate that only bank 1 was indeed lean under a load condition. Let me go ahead and show you that real quick. Okay, so in this freeze frame, we can see our long-term fuel trim bank 1 here is actually high at 24.2%. I believe the P0171 code sets at 24% on this car at 2 consecutive drive cycles at hitting that. And we have long-term fuel trim bank 2, we see at about 0.2%. Looking at our short-term fuel trims, we see that there's not correction in the negative here, so this is a legitimate bank 1 lean condition as at least confirmed by this freeze frame. Now, the other thing that I show in that video on fuel trims is that we can get some clues here onto whether this is a vacuum leak issue or a fuel deficit issue, either by inadequate fuel delivery or too much unmetered air. We can look here, the throttle is open based on our throttle position angle. So as I mentioned in that video on understanding fuel trims, you are not likely to have a vacuum leak condition when the throttle plate, the butterfly, is open. Also, we can see we're at 1800 RPM, the engine is under load. This is indicating either we're getting insufficient fuel delivery on this bank or that we are getting some unmetered air entering that bank. Like an exhaust leak or something. So this gave us some good direction on what to look at on the scan tool. So let's go ahead and look at the scan tool data. And by the way, my apologies, I could not find a long, thin Phillips tipped screwdriver to use as a pointer, so I'm using my penis. Okay, and hopefully this red shows up well on the camera. I noticed that in the previous series it didn't so much, but what we're looking at here on the top graph here is our engine speed, and on the bottom graph in red, long-term fuel trim bank 1, and in green, long-term fuel trim bank 2. We can see green is holding steady within spec at about 6 or 7, and only bank 1 seems to have reaction with throttle. I didn't show throttle. Down at the bottom here is our O2 sensor traces from, again, in red bank 1, in green bank 2. Here we're at wide open throttle. You see that we go rich on the O2 sensors, giving us a clue that our fuel delivery is probably good. And again, we're only worried about on one bank anyway. But notice that every time we increase RPMs, we increase the demand for fuel on bank 1, confirming the freeze frame data that we saw earlier. So this becomes relatively easy to come up with some ideas at what could be the problem. So obviously, why would this car need an exorcist? This seems pretty basic for any advanced enthusiast and certainly a professional mechanic. You have to just come up. As I've said many times earlier, it is actually easier on a V engine when you have a bank-specific condition because it greatly minimizes the number of variables you have to consider. So, of course, I asked everybody, what they would think of, and we came up with all of the common valid explanations for this: an exhaust leak, fuel injector imbalance, possibly O2 sensor problem on one bank, things like that. So in the process of running down our list of things that could be the problem, we found that we had a much more sinister problem that was lurking in the background. And that problem was, we found out that my scan tool, which is called AutoTap, was actually not reporting data on bank 2. So that normal looking 6 or 7 long-term fuel trim on bank 2 apparently was not real. How do we know that bank 2 is not actually really communicating, shown in green here on the long-term fuel trim? Well, what I did was I added propane into the intake to validate if the oxygen sensors are working. And what we have here in red is O2 sensor trace for bank 1, green O2 sensor bank for trace 2. At this point, of course, I add propane. You see we go rich on the O2 sensors, but only bank 1 long-term fuel trim goes negative. Notice bank 2 does not budge at all. Now, not shown here, as a matter of fact, let me go ahead and show you. The short-term fuel trims on both bank 1 and 2 go negative immediately upon the induction of propane. But despite the short-term fuel trim from bank 2 going just as negative, the same way bank 1's short-term fuel trim does, bank 2 did not change. So this, as you can see, creates a major concern, because is this actually a bank 1 lean condition we have with the 0171, or are both banks actually working, but bank 2 for some reason not reporting to the scan tool? And then this is just an opposite example using a vacuum leak induction. So here we've got our bank 1 and bank 2 O2 front sensor traces. At this point right here, I induce a rather significant vacuum leak. Down at the bottom, you see we immediately get short-term fuel trim increase to demand for fuel to compensate for the lean condition. But again, only bank 1 long-term here reacts to it. Bank 2, while it looks like there is some reaction here, it's obviously not appropriate. This is not an oxygen sensor issue, obviously, but just to be safe, what I did was I swapped the oxygen sensors in their respective banks to see if I could move this problem over to the other bank, and I did not. Bank 2 still, even after swapping the O2 sensor positions, continued to show this pattern of behavior, and this caused a major concern in if we actually do have a bank-specific issue. So at that point, trying to figure out what the hell is going on there, enter my hero, Steve Robb, one of the subscribers to the channel, who happens to be a professional mechanic, and explained to me the concept of substituted values, which was unbeknownst to me at the time and sort of rocked my world and pretty much changed the way I'm going to do things from now on. As part of that, I learned about enhanced mode in a scan tool versus generic parameter mode, and how the generic parameter mode should show non-substituted values, only real data if you want to call it that. So the next step was to see what happens if I put a scan tool in generic mode. Now, with AutoTap, which where I was getting all my data from before, and where I have for the 6 years I've been doing this as sort of an advanced do-it-yourselfer, I guess, that there is a problem in that with AutoTap, that scan tool only defaults to enhanced parameter mode if it is available. I cannot make it go into generic mode. But luckily for me, about a year ago, I bought another scan tool that's good for home mechanics called Auto Ingenuity, where I can get generic or enhanced parameters by just simply selecting. So I decided to go ahead and do generic parameters on Auto Ingenuity and repeat this test. So moving on with Auto Ingenuity, I find that in generic mode, it actually does show both banks do go equally lean. And that apparently in my AutoTap scan tool, bank 2 seems to be some type of substituted value for the long-term fuel trim. But why? The O2 sensor seems to be working, and the short-term fuel trim seems to be working. Big mystery. So to add to this pain, while experimenting with this generic mode and this new set of data now, I sort of put together a pattern that after the car goes into closed loop, once it hits closed loop, for the next 10 minutes, the car will be lean at idle, but then improve that lean condition with load. In other words, indicating a vacuum leak. And of course, this is on both banks now. But then later on, after driving the car for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, it turns out this reverses. The car is actually running at normal fuel trims for the most part under idle, but then when I hit the gas pedal, it starts indicating the exact opposite, not a vacuum leak, but a fuel deficit issue or some type of unmetered air issue. So we have variability there now. So the evidence for that issue is shown here. What I did was, after confirming by using propane induction and a vacuum leak induction, that now under generic mode, both bank 1 and bank 2 long-term fuel trims do react appropriately in generic mode, I decided to drive the car. And basically what this is showing is every time that I'm stepping on the gas, we are dropping the fuel trim from approximately 20 long-term fuel trim down to a little bit under 10. And this actually is very consistent here. Here you see a sustained effect with holding the throttle down, and I'm greatly holding down that fuel trim on both banks reacting now under generic mode. So is this indicative of a vacuum leak? Well, it certainly is, and it certainly seems a vacuum leak for both banks. But wait, later on, while driving the car, we see this reverse now. And granted, the scale is not very big. I should have set higher amplitude here, but keep in mind I was driving the car at the time and didn't want to be programming the scan tool. But what we're seeing is at idle, we're actually sitting at a 0 fuel trim here. That's actually 0% on both banks. However, whenever I hit the throttle, we increase to about 20 long-term fuel trim on both banks. Exactly the opposite as what happened approximately 15 minutes before. Now, actually, I have an explanation for that. So what would that explanation be? Well, actually, it's very simple. I believe that the best explanation, there may be both a vacuum leak and some type of unmetered air or fuel deficit issue at the same time. But the vacuum leak fixes itself once the car fully warms up. Sound a little bit out there? Actually, it's not. I wish I could have done a video on it, but I've actually seen this several times before. A great case in point is it was a Mercury Cougar, I believe it was. The car actually has such a bad intake manifold leak, it actually won't start when it's cold. Once you can get it started and it sputters and you get it warmed up, eventually it runs perfectly fine. Now, when the engine is running perfectly fine, the fuel trims look normal. You put a smoke machine on it, you don't detect any leak. For all practical purposes, the car is fine. As a matter of fact, it was a problem when I first got the car that I could not find anything wrong with it. But after letting the car overnight, yeah, definitely, the car wouldn't even start. You put the smoke machine on it when the car is dead cold, smoke billowed from the intake manifold almost like the brake booster hose was off. So that is possible. You can have an intake manifold vacuum leak that seals itself perfectly. And that might explain the variability on the time driving with seeing these contradictory issues. So that said, we still have one other variable that we have to consider. So this final possibility, well, we did enhanced parameter mode in auto tap, find bank 2 shows no reaction. We did generic mode in auto ingenuity, find that both banks do seem to react appropriately to variables. The final possibility is enhanced mode in auto ingenuity. Does it show the same as generic mode? And it turns out it does not. It's kind of a problem because it's very variable. I have had where in enhanced mode with auto ingenuity, it actually did not report bank 2. Bank 2 was straight lined and only bank 1 was responding to any variability. And then other times in enhanced mode that did not happen. So the idea is we need to determine a couple of things. First of all, is the scantool data that we are getting where it's showing a non-response from bank 2, is it possible, and there is some evidence for this, that bank 2 is not acting independently, that maybe it's getting substitute values for whatever, for long-term fuel trim, maybe even short-term fuel trim, from the other bank, from bank 1. Is that possible? Well, we have to rule that out, and I failed miserably at doing that in the last series, but I've learned since then and I know what I'm going to do to prove that. The other thing that we need to do is we have to find out which of these scantool parameters we need to use, because we have actually in some cases diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive data that would lead us in one direction or a complete opposite direction. And this is the reason in that last video that we just went all over the place in the series, because we were looking in different directions and looking at the possible explanations for each of those directions. I need to determine which direction is real. It may not be the one we want, but it is going to be the one that's real. So that is the other objective that we are going to do. So what we are going to do is I'm going to first and foremost see conclusively, do we have a single bank issue or is this a whole engine issue? And the other thing I want to do, given the variability that we're seeing on the enhanced parameter mode and the fact that some of the input parameters are only available in enhanced mode, is that data that I'm seeing actually real? Because I know that I've got some question about that. So that's another thing we're going to do today. But let's start with the first thing first. Right now, the engine is cold. This is a great time to take advantage because all the other tests are going to require the engine to be in closed loop. Let's go ahead and do a vacuum test on the cold engine and verify if we might have an intake manifold leak when the engine is cold, because this is our only chance to do it. All right, so one advantage with having a smoke machine for sure, the advantages are obvious, but one definite one is, of course, the fact that I can easier test on a cold engine. As I've said, I've definitely seen a number of times where you can have a vacuum leak on a cold engine, but then it runs fine when it's fully warmed up. That'd be very hard to check using propane or brake cleaner around the intake, listening for idle changes. You won't be able to look at fuel trim because you don't have you're in open loop at the time. So this is a huge advantage, but I've definitely seen at least 3 or 4 times an engine that has a vacuum leak when it's cold and severe drivability problems, but when it's warm, you won't detect a vacuum leak. It's kind of interesting. So I'm not seeing anything going on here. And as a matter of fact, it does look like we're getting resistance on the check valve. So just that alone, the fact that we're building up pressure is good indication that we don't have a leak. So vacuum leak, both cold and hot engine. Let's just verify we're getting smoke. All right, so you can hear that pressure when I lit up on this valve oil fill cap. And you can see the smoke probably billowing out of it. But just hearing that hiss, that strong pressure is good indication. And there is not a trace of smoke anywhere. Yeah, so I've been checking pretty thoroughly, and granted I'm kind of favoring bank 1 a little bit just because of that freeze frame, but I actually have an explanation for that freeze frame if it turns out that this is truly a dual bank issue. While I'm looking here, I have shown in a video before and mentioned before, you can have a P0171 code or a P0174 despite the fact both banks are definitely affected, because if one bank is below the threshold to set the code, for example, bank 1 is at 25 long-term fuel trim and bank 2 is at 23 long-term fuel trim, and the code sets at 2 consecutive drive cycles with 25, you will get an 0171 despite the fact that clearly you have a dual bank issue. That's not the case on this freeze frame. I understand that. The freeze frame indicates that bank 1 is very high, but bank 2 is normal. The thing is that with my aftermarket exhaust system, I do believe that bank 2's oxygen sensor is located several inches behind in relation to bank 1's location. So in other words, bank 1 will see a change just slightly before bank 2 will, because it takes a half a second for that exhaust to reach the bank 2 sensor. So there may be a little lag in the O2 sensor responses. And if we had that freeze frame maybe a half a second later, we would have seen both banks high. So just a possibility. I don't know if that's the exact reason, but it is an explanation. But I will tell you this, there's no smoke coming out of this engine at all. All right, well, as Paul Danner would probably say, I do not have any flue from my smoke machine. There is no smoke. I do not see any smoke. 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 All right, so, I want to make sure I plug back in my brake booster, and I did check, of course, that the brake booster itself is also not leaking. But one thing I want to do right now, before we start getting to getting a direction, I want to take advantage again of the cold engine and address something that one of the people brought up in the previous series, and that is they thought that it's possible IAT sensor inaccuracy could explain the issues here, especially with the variability at different times, maybe different IAT readings when the engine is cold versus when it's warmed up. I don't think that's going to be it, but it is it's a valid explanation given what we have. It can certainly affect a little bit your idle and stuff like that. So while the engine's cold, we're going to do a couple of tests to rule out the IAT and also anything else I can think of that might be applicable when the engine is cold. Okay, and while I come up with a couple ways actually that we're going to test the accuracy of this IAT, I should point out that I had to clear the P0171 code that instigated all of this as part of what I was doing in the last series. But I have driven the vehicle rather extensively trying to get that code to come back, because it would be excellent if we could duplicate that freeze frame, obviously. And I cannot get, we're going to go to generic here, I think. I cannot get that code to come back. And this is despite the fact that I'm easily hitting 24 long-term fuel trim numbers on Well, actually, I take it back. On enhanced parameter, it shows higher long-term fuel trims than it does under generic. But so under the enhanced parameters, I'm easily at 24 for at least a couple drive cycles on both banks. So I'm not sure why it isn't throwing. Maybe on generic, it's not hitting 24, which I think is where the code sets. So that might explain why. But definitely seeing consistent high fuel trim on both banks either way. But anyway, it's kind of a bummer because I'd like to have a duplication of that code and see if we find that it shows up on two banks this time, or if it once again shows up on just bank one. All right, so what I've got here is the air intake temperature sensor, which I'm also going to unplug. Well, obviously that's going to change it. At least we know the circuit works there. But let me go ahead and plug this back in. Okay, so it's reading 82 degrees. Let's see if that'll show up. Yeah, we're going to just put it right there. It's showing 82 degrees, and it is, at least by my thermometer in the garage, it's about 78 degrees, 79, so pretty accurate. Another way I could pull up engine coolant temperature, but I think it's actually more accurate to do what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is use this digital thermometer. I'm going to aim it. Let's get that turned on and make sure we're in Fahrenheit. I'm going to aim that at the IAT here, and we see about 84.8 degrees versus, I mean, it might almost be 83 degrees there, but as you can see, we're just a couple degrees off. So the IAT is at least measuring good at ambient. Now the question is it also measuring with any temperature changes as the engine warms up or something? So let's find out. So what I'm going to do to test that it is responsive is I'm going to put a hair dryer. So let's see, we can see that it is increasing, and it is, well, let's see, let's get a little closer here. There we go. So obviously a little difference in the air temperature versus the plastic temperature, but as you can see, we're pretty close there, and it clearly is measuring warmer temperature without a problem. And then turning off the dryer, it's cooling down pretty readily. See if we can cool it a little bit more. So I don't think that we're going to consider that a problem with the lean condition. And obviously we kind of jumped ahead a little bit there because an IAT would be a dual bank input, and if we find that we only have an issue on one bank, then IAT would have been ruled out anyway, but I wanted to do that while the engine was still cold. So what we're going to do now is really the most important thing, I think, and that is we have to determine our direction. Do we have a dual bank lean condition issue, or do we have a single bank condition issue? Well, one of the first things we have to do to validate this, because we have conflict with the freeze frame and the scan tool, the way we have to do this, I have to validate if each bank is acting independently to variables. If each bank is acting independently to variables, then I am going to believe the scan tool data that shows both banks are lean, and I am going to dismiss the freeze frame. You have to be scientific about this to make absolutely sure you're heading in the right direction. The evidence will choose the direction for us, so we want to be completely unbiased. And what I'm going to do in order to do that, I'm going to induce a lean condition on each bank and verify that the other bank does not respond equivalently to the bank with the lean condition. In the last series, I made an egregious error with this. I decided the way to induce this lean condition on one bank would be to unplug a fuel injector. Unbeknownst to me, at the time, I got some wicked data that sent us on all kinds of other directions because I didn't realize doing that will cause the system to go into an error mode called open loop 3, in which case it no longer does fuel trim. The problem is that made the other bank react identically to the bank that I induced the variable on because both banks are reacting to open loop. So that's why we had evidence at that point that we are getting sort of one bank data and the other bank is borrowing from it. So I think I've learned my lesson from that. Now, obviously, a way to fix that would be to induce a spark, a no spark lean condition, a misfire with no spark. But the thing is, I tend to not mix real well with electricity. So if I do if I unplug a spark plug wire, I'm going to get shocked. I'm pretty much sure of that. So what I'm going to do is I've got another idea where I can do the no fuel lean condition, which I think is better anyway.